Welcome, everybody. We've got special guest, Dr. Mike T. Nelson, who's been a friend of Heidi and mine for quite a long time, and he is a treasure trove of knowledge. What I didn't know about Mike, and one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast, is that Mike himself is a corporate escapee. So you're going to get a really good idea of what Mike had to do to escape himself from corporate. And of course, I still work in corporate, and I've kind of created this corporate wonderland experience where I have escaped from corporate without quitting my job. And I'm still interested in the full corporate escape. And that's why we have people that have done it before, that have all this knowledge. And I can't wait for you all to hear the story and the insights from Dr. Mike T. Nelson.
All right, Mike. So let's just start out. Would you have a story for us of how or why that you are escaped corporate?
Yeah, I think probably the most, I guess you'd say, pivotal moment was I had been working in the cardiac med tech industry for, God, at that point, 7 years full time. And I was over in more of the engineering land looking at designing leads. So little wires that run from, we used to work on implantable pacemakers and defibrillators, and leads with little wires that would run from the device and actually would be screwed into the heart tissue. So I was on one of the design teams there, and my boss at the time, I had transitioned departments, and I asked him, I said, well, we're pretty flexible with, times. I said, we only have an hour for lunch. There wasn't a gym on site at that point. I said, is it possible I could take a little bit longer than an hour so I could go to the gym? I'll stay later. I'll make up the time. I'm not trying to weasel out of any time or anything like that. I just said, if I can get that done during the day, it's just easier for me. I'll be more productive, because other than that, I was, leaving work at 6 or 7 at night, and then I would go train. As you guys know, it's just hard to downregulate after that. And then I would get to bed late, and it was just this weird cycle. And I remember in my head, I thought, well, of course he's going to say yes. I'm telling my boss how I can be more productive. I'm not trying to weasel out of work. I'm trying to, be more productive and be proactive. And he's like, no, you get 1 hour. And I'm like, 1 hour? And then so I kept kind of badgering him on this. And eventually he's like, okay, if we hit our next, project deadlines, then you'll be able to. Well, long story short, we hit our deadlines, and then, oh no, something else came up, and then something else came up. And it was at that point I was just like, this is so weird. Like, I don't have any meetings. I don't have anything fixed that I have to physically be here. And that's when I kind of decided that, oh, maybe I don't fit in this environment. Maybe
Gee,
it's just an odd thing that it took me that long. I contemplated it. I had been thinking about it for a while, but that was kind of the point where I was like, oh, you mean sitting at your desk in case a bigger boss shows up, even though you may not be productive, is like the thing, which to me was just bizarro.
it is. It's so strange. And this is one of those things I think separate some people where nobody wants to be at their desk 9 hours a day just to be visible, to make it look like you're at work and at your desk.
Right.
and yet, like, some people will just, like, quietly in desperation keep doing it, and others like you, Mike, will say, I don't fit. Like, this is not what I'm going to do with my life. I'm not just going to keep doing this. So, like, you went through this experience, right? I just want to work out. I'll make up the hours. If I work out for an hour and a half, then I'll work an extra half hour during the day. Like, it's not a big deal. The work gets done. And I remember when I was in Colorado working for a pharmaceutical company, I was making a production batch. So I was in the plant, and it was a really long production batch for a clinical trial. So really important. I'm in a bunny suit. You got to get all dressed up and, like, sanitize your hands, sanitize your feet, like, sanitize the room. Somebody has to come into the room with these microbe plates and do microbe swabs in the room to make sure there's no bacteria in the room before you start. So all this had to get done. So I got into work super early. It was like, I don't know, 8:15, 8:30. I walked back to my desk, and over the intercom, we had this intercom system at work, which is bizarre. It was like high school. And they're like, Thaddeus Owen to Cody's office, slams down the phone. And I'm like, now what? And he just, like, started swearing at me and yelling at me. And he's like, why were you not at your desk at 8:00? And it's like, I was in the back making a production batch for this clinical trial. He's like, I don't care what you're doing. 8:00 at your desk, 5:00 at your desk. I'm going to be walking around every day. And if everyone's not at their desk, there's going to be like hell to pay. And I'm like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. And then
It's
you
like
kind of
worse than
found a
high
moment.
school.
Seriously.
It was worse than high school. It was insane. Like, I am an engineering professional. I know what I need to do to get this batch done. I'm just going to go do it, but that's not good enough. Like, we had to be seen. And that's part of the corporate world that I think needs to go away. But what separates people like you and people like us from some others that will just put their heads down and they'll do the things they're told to do and keep doing it and then wonder why they're not getting anywhere. So, like, what did you, Mike, know? I mean, it sounds like you were doing this for 7 years or so, but you're not like 20 years old right now looking at you. I mean, you look really
Yeah.
young. Um,
I'll be
so
50 this year.
that's amazing. So if anyone sees Mike, he looks amazing. So
Oh, thank you.
he definitely knows what he's doing here.
So is Jody. All of three of us.
Yeah,
are
she'll be
50
50
this
too.
year.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So you obviously did something else. Like, you started out your working life, not working for this med tech company and not being an entrepreneur. Like, what did you originally think you were going to do?
So when I originally went to college, I did my undergrad, did Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science. At the time, I was going to do a dual degree program. I was going to get a Bachelor of Arts, and then I was going to go to Michigan Tech and get a Bachelor of Science in engineering. But at the time, I loved like just tearing stuff apart, but not really getting it back together. And I had a 10 scale radio controlled car. I'd spent hours modifying and racing and all this stuff. But I just loved physiology, and biology I thought was super interesting. At the time, biomedical engineering wasn't really a thing because I would call up HR departments. This is back in the mid 90s. And be like, hey, if I had a master's or a bachelor's in biomedical engineering, like what are my odds of getting a job here?
Oh shit.
And one of the HR people
hold
told
on,
me,
hold on.
yep.
Wait, it's fine. We can just edit that out. I don't know what we're trying to get the microphone stands. We have
Oh, uh-oh.
Sorry.
Technical difficulties.
I know, but I needed to hear him. But it was recording. Yeah. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, no worries.
Sorry.
So I called the HR person at a couple of companies and said, hey, if I have a bachelor's or a master's in biomedical engineering, what are my odds of getting a job? And two of them basically told me, 0. We throw your resume in the trash. And I'm like, what? And they said, we have no box for biomedical engineering. Like, no one in the corporation had graduated from that program yet because it was so new. I was like, oh crap, that's not good. So I decided I'll go to mechanical engineering. My fallback was, in worst case, I could go work in the automotive industry or something else. I would have a, air quotes, kind of standard degree. And when I was doing all this, I thought, well, I'll work for a biomedical company for a while. And when I got done, I did that, but I also realized, oh, wow, I actually really like physiology a lot. So I just started taking more physiology classes for fun. And the ironic part about the corporation was, depending upon how you were internally classified, I was this weird person who did a master's degree in mechanical engineering, but because I had taken so much physiology, I had more of a background than almost all the engineers in physiology. And so I remember for one of the projects I was on, we were sitting next to this guy, and I was the physiology expert along with one of the other persons who, she had actually a legitimate PhD in physiology. And he's drawing the equation for stress up on the whiteboard. And he's like sitting there, like scratching his head, and like it's not working out. And I look around the corner and I'm like, oh yeah, like your denominator, you have like the wrong, symbol in there. He's like, what? How do you know this? And I'm like, I have a master's in mechanical engineering. He's like, oh, I thought you were just the physiology person. So it's just so weird how you get binned into certain areas and certain roles, and then that's kind of what you become known for per se, and it doesn't really change. Where then later I got transferred to a design team, and then it's like, oh, you're just just do engineering. We don't care about physiology. It was just straight ahead testing at that point.
That's it's something I ran into. So, my background, original degree was chemical engineering. And as I'm like going through my career, what you don't know when you get into the corporate world, typically from college, although that's not the only route, I found like I didn't even know that there were jobs that did X, Y, and Z. And
Oh,
so
sure.
I would start interviewing people, like not interviewing myself, but say, hey, can we spend 15 minutes and get coffee, which I recommend to everybody to do just to find out more. And I would ask them, what's your background? How did you get into this job? And then what type of person and background do you look for to do this role? Because it sounds interesting to me. And it would always be like some specialized degree. And when they put out, today would be on LinkedIn searches or whatever of a job opening, they really pigeonhole people into these, like, we're looking for a whatever it is, mechanical engineer with 2 years of project management experience and blah blah. And like, if you don't have that, they just throw your resume away completely. Like, nope, because it's typically a recruiter who's looking for to fill the role. And so they see like doesn't meet the criteria on this like form that somebody filled out, so they throw it away. Well, this happened to us at our corporation on a role a friend of mine was hiring for, still within like the larger department I work for. And we had a friend who would have been a perfect fit for this job because I had known him for a while. I knew his background and how he thinks. But in the corporation, they're like, no, he doesn't have a 4-year degree. He's unqualified. He doesn't even get an interview. So luckily, I got him an interview. And then it was between him and 3 other candidates. I kind of presented a case like, hey, I know these other guys have the degree, but they're going to get bored. This guy's going to be a rock star. He's a big thinker. He's really going to love the role. And he's going to want it. If you enjoy what you're doing, then you're going to be a lot better at it because you're curious and you're interested and you're motivated. But the corporation, like the corporate environment, they don't even think about those things. Where
Oh no.
as I look at entrepreneurial environments, it's so different. Well, anyway, long story short, he got the job and he's been there almost 2 years and everyone's like, oh my God, he was the best hire we've ever made. And he was completely outside the corporate mold. He did not have the degrees, but he is the best person for the job. And I see entrepreneurs do this all the time, Mike, but I almost never see this done in a corporation. So like you are working in the corporate world as an engineer, and now you've got this physiology background. Like you had that story earlier where, well, what I can't spend an extra half hour and get something done that's going to make me more effective. Like, when did you know that you wanted to be an entrepreneur and leave the corporate world? Like, that was kind of like this come to Jesus moment of like, what, I can't work out. But there must have been a time that you were thinking about like, hey, maybe this isn't the right fit in general, and I should start thinking about something else.
I think the question is like, at what point did you realize that corporate culture was crushing your soul?
Yeah, it was kind of combined events because at that time I had done my Bachelor of Arts, I had done post grad work, I did my master's. So I did almost 8 years of school full time before I started working there. Swore I was never going back to school. Started taking all these physiology classes, and a buddy I met who had worked for a competitor company, he's like, well, because I was like, maybe I should get another bachelor's. He's like, nobody cares if you have another bachelor's. I'm like, well, maybe I'll get another master's. Like, nobody cares if you have another master's. Like, you already have one master's degree. And he's like, you should do a PhD in biomedical engineering. And I'm like, oh, okay. Because, at that time, I could always fall back and say I had mechanical engineering. So long story short, I spent 5 years taking classes for that in my quote free time. And during that process, I kept thinking that I really like this physiology stuff, but I don't know what to do with it. I would go to personal training conferences and just annoy people to death about why they don't read actual research, which I thought was crazy. And one person looked at me and went, that's why we come to these conferences. And I was like, oh, like, oh, I get it. And that was combined with just being in a corporate environment that I didn't understand why things weren't more efficient. For example, like there would be people that would show up in my cube and they'd be like, hey, did you get that email? And I actually put an autoresponder on my email for a while that said, I'm only checking my email at 8 a.m., noon, and 4 p.m. If you need something between these times, please call me. I'm literally sitting at my desk all the time. Because I realized after a few months, like I could literally spend all day just doing email and get nothing else done, right? And so people would then see the message, would not read it, would show up into my cube and be like, hey, did you get that email? And my canned response was always, no, I'll check my email at this next time. I'm sure it's there. I'm like, was this something that's very urgent? And they'd be like, no, just wanted to make sure you got it. And I'm like, well, I'm here. You have my attention now. Do we want to talk about this thing? It seems like it's urgent. Oh, no, just checking. It was this weird, or my other thing I would do all the time is there would be like 20 people on an email, and you read this like 3-page thing, and you'd be like, okay. And I would write back, reply all, whose action item is this? Because I know what would happen. Everyone would assume it was somebody else's action item because it wasn't clearly stated. And then the shit's going to hit the fan in about 2 weeks when nobody did anything on it. And then everyone's going to be pissed about it. And so I realized all these like weird, simple things would just drive me insane. And then I realized, oh, again, maybe this isn't really a fit. Maybe I can go do this physiology thing. At the time, I thought, well, I'll go be assistant professor. Long story short, I ended up transferring to exercise physiology, did my PhD there. And during that process, I fast realized, oh crap, I don't really want to be a professor either. Because I looked at what the path was. I'm like, okay, so say I graduate, get my PhD in exercise phys. Let's say I do get a job somewhere. Oh crap, now I got to do a postdoc, which is 2 to 4 years, basically being somebody's indentured servant to learn skills. Okay, great. Okay, let's say I make it through that and somehow, manage a way to finance it. Oh crap, if I'm on a 10-year track and I get tenure in, 5, 8, 10 years, now I just have more meetings, writing grants, like all this stuff I just didn't want to do at all. And with the advancement of the internet, which this is related, I realized like, oh, wait a minute. If I don't need the money, I could literally help people with other studies because I knew enough people I could call up and be like, hey, buddy, like, do you need help with this study? Like, oh, well, what does it cost? I'm like, no, it's free. I want to help you with the study. I don't need the income. And if I had the skill set, most people would be like, well, yeah, I'm not going to turn down like free help. So I could do some research if I wanted to without being with an academic institution. So all those kind of combined, and the only option for me left was, well, maybe I should do this on my own. So it was more like just this process of weird elimination that was kind of the only thing left that seemed like it would fit.
So what is it that you ended up doing, Mike? Like, I mean, you help others with research. You were saying you could do that for free, but you don't need the income. Like, you must have income coming from somewhere. So, like, can you describe what it is that when you left? Well, and I think maybe you did some of this before you left. I mean, if I remember your
Yeah, I
story
did.
correctly. So, can you talk about like what you do now, but also how did you do that while you were still working for the corporation too?
Yeah, so once I knew for sure I was going to leave, I went to my financial advisor and said, hey, I'm going to quit my corporate job making at that point, $58,000 a year, and I'm going to go be a personal trainer. And he looked at me and went, you're insane. What are you doing? And I'm like, oh, he's like, how much money do you think you can make doing that? And, had a house payment, had loan payments, all this stuff too. And he kind of talked some sense into me, and I was like, oh yeah, ooh. He's like, what if it doesn't go well? Like, what if you miss a mortgage payment? Like all these things I just, I didn't think of. I just thought, I'll just make more money doing that. And I realized, ooh, okay, I should probably spend a little more time thinking about this. So what I ended up doing was when I went back to do my PhD, when I was in exercise physiology, I realized that doing that and working full time are not compatible. So the original job I had in technical service, I went back to them and said, hey, I know you're short 2 people right now. I'll switch back into the department because I did this job before for 6 years. You can train me to be on call. It'll take maybe a month. Or if they had a new person to train someone to be on call in that position, took 8 months. So I knew that I had an advantage because I did the job before. But I said, the caveat is I'm only going to work part-time. And they were like, well, we're not doing that. We can't have people work part-time. It's just not part of company policy. So I went to HR and said, hey, do you have anyone that works part-time? And they said, well, you can job share with someone and you would still maintain full benefits. Obviously, your pay is knocked down. So I went back and I said, well, HR says that it's legal. I just need someone to job share with. And they're like, well, we don't have anyone. So I went around the department and just asked everyone, like, hey, anyone want a job share?
Good.
And one person who was coming back after maternity leave is like, yeah, I would love to do that. So we basically split one role, which allowed me then to drop to 24 hours a week and still maintain my benefits.
So hang on, before you tell the story of like what you actually did to make extra money in your business at the time, and then when you left and went full time, this is something I see all the time. Like people want something, but they're afraid to speak up for what they
Yeah.
want all the time in the corporation. And I manage people. So I am trying to develop people in their career. And like, it's almost like they're afraid to tell me what they want to do. Cause like, oh, if I
Hmm.
don't like it, I won't give them a promotion, or I won't, you know, keep them. I might lay them off, whatever it is. They're so afraid. And I totally changed my mindset around that and did something similar to you where I was like, I know what I want and I'm going to start asking for it. And not just asking for it, but I'm going to say, this is what I want. What do I have to do to get it? And then have them tell me what to do to get it. Oh, well, you can't get it unless you do X, Y, Z. Done. So you did the same thing. It's like you knew, Mike, you knew what you wanted. And you're like, hey, this is what I want. How do I make that happen? And then like, oh, well, we don't have anyone to make it happen to job share with you, but you didn't stop. You weren't like, oh, okay, I won't do it. You're like, no, I'm going to go ask people if they want a job share. Like, how did you give yourself permission to do that? What was the like the mindset or the thought process?
The biggest thing I realized was you're just looking for points of leverage, because I knew that, like I said, it was about 8 months, maybe 7 months max, if they took a brand new person off the street before they could be on call in the department. So there's a huge amount of training, huge amount of time, huge amount of upfront investment. They don't know if that person's going to stay. We had a few people, not that often, but every so often, person be on call for 6 months, and they're like, "Man, I hate this job. I quit." Right? So now you invested more time in them than they were actually there. So I knew that I had an advantage because I had done the job before, and they could justify it by saying, okay, well, yeah, he's only part-time, but he'll be on call full-time. And being on call was the rate limiter of people to do the job. It wasn't necessarily the volume of calls, because it was a technical service job in the office. It was trying to fill all the off times, because at that point in the entire world, we were the only people who were on call 24/7. So it was just the schedule of trying to manage this, because physicians could call from the middle of a procedure, God knows where, at midnight. Hey, we got the lead stuck in the valve. What do we do? You would be one of the people they would call and talk to. So I knew that that was their rate limiter. And I knew that if I could provide a solution to that, that I had some leverage. And my leverage was, well, hey, if I can't work part-time, then I'm just not going to come over. I'll just stay at my other job over here, knowing that I didn't want to stay. I didn't want to do that anyway. I hadn't thought past that that very far. And eventually they said, oh, okay, sure, which was kind of surprising. But I think the takeaway is look for how can you kind of make it a win-win for both, because there has to be an advantage for them to do it, not just because, oh, we like you, you're a nice person, right? There has to be a case that it is beneficial for them to do the thing that also is beneficial to you.
That's what I like to call that entrepreneurial thinking. So if you're an employee and you're waiting for someone to tell you what to do, where you're going to sit, what chair you get to sit in, and what you get to work on, that's one mindset. But if you change your mindset to an entrepreneurial mindset, which is exactly what you did, you're just like, here's a pain point. I'm going to help them find a solution. So you're like, here's what's happening. Here's how we can solve it. And of course, they're going to be like, oh, you can fix something for us? Like, that's unusual. Like, let's try that out. And I think that's huge to switch that mindset to that entrepreneur, where entrepreneurs all day long, like, where's my pain point? Or where is there a pain point in my industry or my hobby or whatever it is that I can solve? And then you have a business. And I mean, you kind of created a business inside the company of like, how can I solve a problem? So I love that. So keep going with like, okay, so you switch over to technical service and you're part-time now?
Yeah, so I was working 24 hours a week, but I was on call full time, which to me was fine because on call was off hours. Like the biggest issue was, shit, how the hell do I take classes during the day and have to be on campus to do research in the morning and then still work a full-time job? It's just, you can't do it. It's just not possible, at least back then. But off hours, whatever. If I get woken up at like 2, 3 in the morning, whatever, I'm at home, fine. Sucks, but I'll deal with it. So at that time, I started doing that. And as I got closer to doing my PhD, I saw, I should be done in about a year. So I had previously started training people. If I go all the way back in time, 2006, worked at a gym for a while. I ended up, training people here at my own place. The gym filed bankruptcy. I bought a bunch of equipment, started training people out in my garage. So I had been doing that while I was still working in the corporate. So I would do it on weekends, I'd do it in evenings, that type of thing. When I was working part time, I was able to do that for a little bit more. But then the demands of doing a PhD started ramping up. And I realized I'm like, okay, I got to find a way to get out of corporate because my thought pattern was once I finish my PhD, I'll work for a year or two and then I'm done. And so I literally went to my bosses there and told them, like, hey, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to finish my PhD. I will stay for maybe 1 to 2 years max. And then like I'm out of here. Because I was actually trying to get laid off because they had a period of layoffs where originally the first layoff, they let some people volunteer and they did not let other groups volunteer. And that created a whole issue, rightfully so. So the second time they had layoffs, I was still in the engineering department. And I told my boss, I'm like, yeah, you can lay me off. Like, because I would have gotten a big severance package at that time. Like, great, I'll just do my own business, go back to school. Show up to work one day. He's like, okay, here's the deal. You didn't get laid off, but now you're on a design team. I'm like, I don't want to do that. Can I quit? Yeah, you can quit. Like, do I get any severance or any payment or benefits? He's like, nope. But now I'm doing a job I don't want to do, but I'm still employed. He's like, yep. And so that's what sort of really prompted me to switch to technical service and go part time. So while I was there doing part time, I literally went to my manager and said, here's the deal. I'll work for 1 or 2 years. Once I finish my PhD, I'm out. And during the meantime, I'll just be a good average valued employee. I'm not seeking to get any promotions. You don't have to manage me. I'm not trying to find the next level. I don't care. Yes, I want to do my job. Yes, I want to be compliant. Yes, if I'm falling below the standard for all practical purposes, please tell me. I will fix it. But just trying to not be a pain in their ass. Because as you know, like the people that are biggest pain in the ass, ironically, are the people who are not performing. Makes sense. But are also the other group of people who are just like the go-getters who want the highest promotion, the biggest raise, like what is the next thing to do, who are almost like hyper competent because those people take a lot of management. Okay, what project am I put them on? They finish this. Like, how do I, that takes from a management standpoint, takes a lot of time. So I just said, I just want to be an average employee. Like, just don't worry about me. But not doing my job, then just tell me and I'll fix it.
That's actually like, I think if you're listening to this and you're in the corporate world and you're like, wait, what? From what Mike is saying, and from my standpoint as a senior level manager, like all day long, I would love the competent employee that
Yes.
shows up, gets all their shit done, and goes home, and they never ask me about like for more. Like, I
Yep.
mean, they can ask me for more work, but if they're like, I want this promotion, I want to do this, I want that, I want more money because I'm so good. And it's like, that's a hard person to manage. And you're constantly going to the leadership and saying, hey, we need to retain this person. We need to find a new leadership opportunity. But if you are running a group and you've got really good people that love just to show up and get their work done and go home, like that's amazing. So don't think for a minute that like trying to be an average employee and just do a really good job and like be quiet and to yourself because you've got other stuff going on. That's not a bad thing. Like that can be really powerful.
Yeah, and as I got closer to finishing my PhD, I was like, okay, I'm definitely going to transition. I had already decided I didn't want to be a professor. And in my head, I had a cutoff of, okay, if I'm still working 24 hours here and I can replace, my cutoff was 75% of my income, then once I quit, I mean, I'll get those 24 plus hours back, not being on call, then I should be able to make up the other 25%. So for a while, my goal was, okay, what other projects can I do? I started training clients online. Did some work for Eat to Perform, did some work for other companies, did some supplement consulting. So things that were generally asynchronous so that I did not have to work on them during the day because my day hours between the university and corporate were just fixed. I couldn't shoehorn anything more in. But online stuff, I could do all the asynchronous communication. I could write projects, I could write certifications, things like that I could do basically off hours. And my thought was, okay, if I get to 75% of my current income, then I feel safe, kind of making that last bit of a transition because I know I have already got things established. So I think that's other people I've talked to, like, have some, there's no right or wrong, there's no magical number, but have something that you say, okay, 50%, 40%, 70%. When I hit this number and I can do it consistently for 2, 3, 4 months, whatever your metric is, then at least you've established yourself and you can feel comfortable like making that leap. Where I see a lot of people are just like, I don't know, I'll just figure it out. And some people are really good with that. Like a buddy of mine said, like some people change because they want to, and only other people change because they absolutely have to. And there are some people who can make that work, but for me, especially, I was married at that time. We had a house payment. Like you have all these other like adult responsibilities. So I wanted to make sure that that everything would still be okay. Like once I left.
Real quick question on your PhD.
Yeah.
So did work pay for that or did you pay for that?
Well, that was a point of contention because my thought was the reason I wanted to stay for 1 or 2 years after I got done is my assumption was I would get a big pay raise. And at that point, I'd already got the PhD done. That would free up a lot of other time. I was only working part time still. So I could really ramp my business up and I would have the safety income, hopefully a raise from the position. And I should have asked them this ahead of time. But when I got about 2 years from graduating, I asked them and they said, well, no, you don't make any more money at all. I'm like, but I paid for the whole degree myself. Like you paid for like, 2 physiology classes. Like I paid for the rest of it out of my own pocket from money that I made myself. And they said, well, because in theory you're better at doing your job, that you should be able to do the next level of performance and therefore get a raise faster. And I went to HR and I told them flat out, I'm like, okay, but you understand that if I go down the street to your competitor, and I did check with the guy who is a manager at this company, I will literally make $25,000 a year more starting there because I had a terminal degree, I had a master's in engineering, I had a PhD in physiology, and I had 10 years experience at that point. And they said, well, if that's what you need to do, that's what you need to do. And I'm like, no, that's not what I want to do. And I'm like having this conversation with him thinking, this is insane. And at the same time, I talked to another guy who worked in the company in research and who went back, was working there, did his PhD. He's like, okay, here's what you do. You get about a year to finishing your PhD. Tell him that there's no way you can work part-time and finish your PhD. And he's like, trust me, this will be 100% true. You're not lying to them about this. You completely quit. You finish your PhD for that last year. Your non-compete at that time was only 1 year. So your non-compete will expire. And so he did this and he came back literally into the same department doing the same role in research, but now his non-compete had expired. He had finished his PhD and he literally got a pay raise of like $22,000 because he is entering the market with that experience and a terminal degree. There's kind of minimums in HR that they have to consider payment for. Those minimums don't necessarily apply to people that are currently employed. I was like, oh, shit, that would have been kind of good to know.
Oh my God.
Isn't that crazy how that works? I see this over and over. The company pays for you to get an advanced degree because it's going to help you advance in the company and help the company out, ultimately make more money, which
Oh,
is what
sure.
all the companies want to do. And so many people get these MBAs and they get no bonus, no
Yep.
raise, no promotion. And the only way for them to advance in their career and get the money that but get the money that is typically paid to an MBA out of school with years of experience, they have to quit and
Yeah.
come in somewhere else. And it's the most insane thing I've ever seen because the company every time shoots themselves in the foot. They're like, yes, we want you to have this degree. It's going to be helpful to us. And then, no, we're not going to do anything for you once you get it. So they lose all the money they sunk into the individual for their advanced degree. They lose that knowledge base the person generated through working for the company. And then they go and take that somewhere else to make extra money, which it should just be recognized by the company. Like you now have a new class to assess this person to, because instead of whatever, 4 years experience and a bachelor's, now it's 6 years experience and a master's degree or whatever it is. And I see this so many times in the corporate world, which makes people extremely frustrated. So, Mike, can you explain what it is you do today? So you
Yeah.
successfully exited corporate life and you stepped into this entrepreneurial role. And now like we just know you from, you're all over the world, you're presenting everywhere, you're in super high demand. But I actually don't even know all the things that you do. So I'd love
Yeah.
to hear it too.
You do, Mike. You know, the way I was kind of thinking about when you were talking about like it reminded me of a braid, Mike. Like you
Mm.
braided, you know, like your corporate into and there's like all these different pieces and then you just started folding them together. I don't know, I just like had that vision of that, and there's spiritual words for that braiding as well. But I think it's just like really interesting how, you know, it just it did it feel seamless, or was it like you know, like not very, I guess is my question, is like, did it feel at the time like it was kind of, you were in flow and you were flowing through it, or was it
No, it felt
not
like
so
a
much?
freaking disaster, to be
Really?
honest.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, that's
Because,
good for people to know, right? That's
yeah, because at the time, how many people had done that? Like the
mm,
assumption was, especially if you did like a PhD, a terminal degree, that you go be a professor, or there was a handful of people that worked in industry, but not that many. You know,
mm,
the only track was really academics. And I remember seeing John Berardi at the time go back and get a legitimate PhD from a legitimate university, and then just said, screw it, I'm going to start Science Link and I'm going to make precision nutrition. I was
mm,
like, wait, that's an option? Like, that was the first person I ever saw who had an advanced degree who just kind of gave, my words, not his, the finger to academics and said, screw it, I'm going to go do my own thing.
mm.
And when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's actually an option. Oh, oh, cool. Like, I didn't see anyone doing that before.
Well,
And so that was kind of the inspiration, but trying to put it all together, I fast realized when I started doing stuff on my own, especially online, and I'll get to what I do now, I didn't know anything about business. Like
mm,
I knew zero. Like I never took an accounting class, never took a marketing class, I never took any business classes flat out, period. And so I did hire a business coach at that point. I thought being I'll finish my PhD in a year, I'll have the business up and running, I'll do my one more year at the, you know, the corporation, and then I'm out. And it was great. It was super, super helpful. It was ungodly expensive. At the time was $2,500 a month. So I about pissed myself to sleep for like the first 3 months trying to figure out how the hell I'm going to pay for all this shit. Um,
oh my
but I
God.
got this stuff done. Like if he told me to do something, I'm like, I'm
Mm,
sure as hell going to figure out a way to get it done.
mm,
So I worked with him for 2.5 years, and it was super, super helpful. Like the main thing was, how do you communicate? Like how do you write ad copy? Like how do you write newsletters? Like your customer is not you, because at the time everything I had was like hyper technical because that's
mm,
what I liked. And I assumed that that's what everyone else was into. Well, shocker, no, they're not. There's a handful of people who are, more so now than there used to be, but not that many. So learning all those skills definitely wasn't smooth.
mm.
I mean, I had a couple products I tried that are just a disaster. You spent all even 3, 4 months, you paid this guy an obscene amount of money, and it just, you know, didn't work. So eventually I kind of figured it out. And then so now it's kind of this weird hybrid of different things. And my thing that I graded everything against was I wanted more freedom. And the only reason I think to work for yourself is that you get to trade time and money. Now, it's not always that simple, but you have the option of doing that. If you work in a corporate environment, those two things are generally quite fixed. Yes, you could make more money over time. Yes, you could get more vacation, but there's a lot of hard limiters on it. So I said, okay, I want to do online stuff and I want everything to be completely asynchronous. So if we want to go kiteboard in South Padre for a week, we can go down and we can go kiteboard. I don't have to stay home because I've got 5 meetings or whatever. And that's kind of the little thing I use to grade stuff.
Mm.
So right now, I do work as an associate professor for the Carrick Institute. They do a lot of clinical neuroscience. The nice part with that is that it's, I don't want to say it's a made up position because it's a legit position, but it's 100% asynchronous. So I did teach for the graduate school for a little while. And then right now I just do special projects for them. So I create different advanced training for like the neurologists and chiropractors and people that go through. So I create courses for them, which I can do asynchronously. And if other stuff comes up, I do that. Right now, I also consult for Tecton, you guys are familiar with. So they have an exogenous ketone. So I help them with setting up scientific studies primarily through that and some ambassador stuff. I have one-on-one clients that right now I have 16. which I generally cap pretty low. I mean, after COVID, I want to say, what was the actual number? I got up to 29, 31 maybe for a hot minute. And I wanted to carve my right eyeball out with a dull spoon just because of the volatility of it was too much. Right? Because I'm doing all their custom stuff and doing their nutritional mobility, blah, 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 everything. And some nights to be great. You check your client email, cool, everything's good. The next night, you're like, okay, it's an hour before the end of the day, and like 7 people had something happen to them. They need their programs rewritten or whatever. So I didn't like the volatility, so I've kind of scaled back on that. I have the certifications, Flex Diet certification, PhysFlex certification, HRV courses, and then just kind of other, I would say, more random stuff. I still teach for Rocky Mountain University, usually teaching an advanced athlete monitoring course in fall. And then starting 2 years ago, the big projects were writing books. So I'm helping Cal Dietz with the all new version of triphasic training, which will hopefully be out this year. God knows it's taken forever. Not any fault of his per se. Just writing books is hard. Writing a book for human kinetics on metabolic flexibility, and then helping with another book on high flux rates via walking.
Wow. So lots going on. So before we tell people where they can find you, or if they want to be one of those lucky people that can work with you, how to get in touch, what advice would you give people in corporate today that just cannot stand what they do?
If you can't stand it, you probably need to get out. That's number one. Nobody told me that. I just thought for a while I was just the weirdo that, because growing up, like my parents both worked jobs. Like I didn't really, other than some friends of ours who started a winery, I literally did not know anyone who was an entrepreneur or even a business owner for the most part, at least not directly. So I didn't have any models. Like I said, it was just a process of attrition. So I would say it's okay to get out. Number two is just figure out what your plan is to get out. Have some hard cap, at least monetarily wise, because that's easy to measure and something, the world still runs on money, so you're going to need that. And then 3 would be, how do you grade what projects and what you want to do? So I have a Flex Diet mentorship where I teach some of this stuff too, is that it's okay to prioritize what you want to do in your life to run your own business. Because I see way too many people who are like, oh, it's so cool to be an entrepreneur and a business owner. And like, they hate their life for years on end. I'm like, to me, the only reason to do it is because you want the freedom to do what you want to do with your life. If you don't want to do that, then I'd just stay in a corporate world. Like, I don't think it's worth the headaches and the hassle otherwise. But for us, like we wanted the ability, we just were in Mexico for 2 weeks hanging out, went kiteboarding. Yeah, we worked while we were there, but for us, we wanted the freedom to go around and do other things that we wanted to do, not to be like, oh, I put in my vacation like 2 years ahead of time for this week where Bob and Nancy are not gone during that time. If all that kind of stuff bothers you, then yeah, probably doing your own thing is going to be worth it. Last point is, it's a exponential thing. Like, I don't remember what marketer said this. It's like the amount of energy it takes the rocket ship to get into orbit. Like, you're going to spend a lot of time up front. You're going to have a lot of failures. You're probably going to lose money for a while, just things going, and that's normal. But at some point, it should get a little bit easier, or at least your leverage should be better. So for example, now I can do certifications and do stuff like that. When I first started, like, it didn't matter how good the certification was, no one would have bought it because no one would have known anything about it. So you're always kind of working on these scale kind of leverage problems, and that's just to be expected.
Awesome. Anything that I missed, Heidi, that you want to get in there?
No, I really love how you're talking about this points of leverage, and you kind of circled back to that. Anyway, Mike, but this is really good. You guys, this is like sage advice, right? Like, so if somebody is in their job and you just heard those 4 things, as a coach myself, I really hope you wrote them down because those are, I mean, honestly, like that's how we learn, right? And I really love how you used problem solving and critical thinking to not be pigeonholed, Mike. And so many people just put their head down and do what they're told, and like that obedient thing. And you really had like a Scooby-Doo mystery to solve, right? Like that when you were talking about that, I'm like, I'm an artist and I'm creative,
Yeah, yeah.
whatever. So I was like, oh my God, it's like a Scooby-Doo mystery. Like you were running around talking to different people. Well, oh, well, how can I do what was the part-time work or whatever? Share.
Hmm.
I don't know the
Job sharing.
job sharing. Like I didn't even know that was a thing because I've never worked in the corporate world myself. I'm an evasion artist. So
There you go. Perfect.
so it's just really interesting. Like but you were also relentless. And this is one of the things, like I teach my children, I homeschool my children. And in a lot of the things that I talk about, especially with clients that are younger than me, I'm like, figure it out and don't stop. And I think that I see that a lot in generations, like we always say, oh, this generation is, blah, blah, that old adage, whatever. But it's like, no, like this generation doesn't do a lot of problem solving and critical thinking because you're not really taught that. And like what you were just saying too, your examples growing up were not entrepreneurs. So you had to kind of, I call myself a cycle breaker. You, and you're
Yes.
right. I mean, you're definitely a cycle breaker. And that really, pushes, I feel like energetically, like pushes somebody out of that pattern, right? The pattern of doing what my family did and blah, blah. And I came across somebody recently and she was like, hey, think about all the entrepreneurs in your family. And I thought about that and I brought it up to Thaddeus and I was like, oh my God, every single person in my family was an entrepreneur.
Mm,
And I'm like, I didn't even like, you don't think about it like that. And then I asked him and he said, no, he's like, none of them were. So it's
mm.
just so interesting, I think. And I love human behavior and like what, people's history are and stuff. And it's so interesting. Like you became the cycle breaker of your, corporate, I guess always, like the people in your family, whatever you said had jobs and this is what we did. So I just think like inspiration wise, how you were inspired by the person, I can't remember the name. Early on, you said you were inspired by somebody who had
The guy
developed
that
the
started
precision
Precision Nutrition.
nutrition.
Yeah, John Berardi. Yeah.
Yeah, John Berardi, like what an inspiration. So, I mean, this is what we're doing this podcast for too, is like you are an absolute inspiration. And so anybody, younger folks that are thinking, oh, I can't do it, you can braid, you can learn. And that's how we learn, is like from failing and figuring the shit out. Right. So I just think it's really cool and really inspiring what you did. So thank you so
Yeah.
much for
Thank
sharing your
you.
story, Mike. It's great.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
Mike is a phenomenal coach. I mean, he's got a PhD. He's a doctor. He knows a lot of stuff. So if you're interested in learning more about Mike and what Mike does, which get on his newsletter, it's 100% free, and you're a really funny writer, Mike. So I
Oh,
love
thank
getting them.
you.
I'm like, oh, what is he going to be saying this time? And it's hilarious to read his newsletters. They're short. He's got flexibility certifications from metabolic flexibility and physiological flexibility. So, Mike, where can people find out about what you do and how do they get on your newsletter as well?
Yeah, so thank you so much. Best place is probably just the website and the newsletter, the MikeTNelson.com. At the top, there'll be a little button you can get on the newsletter, which is free, and you can just hit reply, and I'll send you a cool free gift from there. And then do have a podcast, which is Flex Diet Podcast, and then social media wise, I guess a little bit on Instagram here and there, which is just Dr. Mike T. Nelson.
Awesome. So definitely check him out, get on his newsletter. It'll be in the show notes, all the links that Mike just mentioned. So you can find those below. And Dr. Mike, it was amazing having you on today's podcast. Remember, if you want to listen to the second half of the podcast, where we get into a little bit more nitty gritty details and things we don't put on hour one, you can go to howtoescapecorporate.substack.com and become a paid member, where you get all the writings that are behind the paywall and all the second hour of our podcasts. Any last words, Heidi?
Oh, I think that's it.
All right.
Good.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mike.
Appreciate it.
They don't want to go back to the office either. So as we get
No.
started in hour two, so welcome back to the podcast, everyone, to Corporate Escape Artists with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. We're talking about how Dr. Mike escaped his corporate job and became a world famous researcher and personal trainer and all things metabolic flexibility, physiology. You kind of combined all those interests into what it is you do now, because Mike, you love researching, like you
Oh,
love
yeah.
reading studies, you love analyzing the studies. Like, tell us a little bit about that. Like, what is it like for you to like read a study, and why is that so interesting to you?
it took me quite a few years to figure out that I realized I just like solving complex problems. And I realize if I'm not feel like I'm solving a problem, then I get bored, and that's not good.
Yeah.
So reading studies are just like these little tiny pieces of the puzzle in one little area. And to me, it's just, having done and published human research, it's a monster pain in the ass to do that stuff. Like to run a full study, to have people come into the lab, whatever it is you're doing. It's not an easy thing. So for me now, I do some studies here and there, but it's pretty minor. To sit and read, like for example, John Fermelin just published this huge study about dosing of 100-gram protein dose, and they did like 3 different tracer studies, radioactive material, labeled isotopes, and he said it when he had the idea to when he finished the study. I think he said it was like 9 years or something.
Wow.
So just for me to sit down and just to read the study twice in a couple hours is like, holy crap, this is amazing. I get a lot of that person and their team, their information and all this work they put into it, like again, leverage, like condensed down into like me reading it a couple hours. And the nice part about me is I can, you know, call him up and be like, hey, you want to do a podcast on this? He's like, yeah, great. So I have all these research people I can just call up if I have questions about, hey, I saw this, this isn't really my area of, this thing to look at muscle protein synthetic response versus this one, is this a good method, or what are the pros and cons? So to me, it's nice to also have the network. And then they're just little tiny pieces of like, okay, how does all this fit together? Does this kind of reaffirm what we know? Does it not? If it doesn't, why doesn't it? So it's just kind of this never ending puzzle of solving human performance. And when you're young enough, you kind of think, oh, well, I did this little area of my PhD and that'll, change the world. And nah, no one ever really reads it. It's like, I think it was like 200 people have ever read like one of the studies I published.
Yeah.
But trying to solve human performance is something that I'll never be able to figure out. So it's also coming to terms with you're working on a problem that there'll never be a single finite solution, and you'll probably never find it. But you can get little pieces along the way. You can have clients execute it and learn things from both the experiential and the kind of data collection side, and how that gap, that applied knowledge, to me, that is the most interesting area.
So you love reading the studies to see whether they correlate with what you already know, whether they tell you something different about what you thought you knew, and applying it to the real world, which is one reason why I love the work that you do. Is not only do you do this deep research on the studies, but you apply it to your clients and to others in their training programs. So like, what's the most fascinating thing, Mike, that you read in a study and applied that worked?
Oh man, there's a bunch of them. I mean, lately I would say, so one of the studies I'm just is mind blowing is I was looking at, okay, how much can you increase aerobic capacity? And these are in like, lifter, meathead type, strength and power type athletes. These are not, people who, are trying to break the 2 hour marathon, which, the performance they do is phenomenal, but that's not the population I'm dealing with. And one of the studies was by Hickson, and it was from 1977. And it was a 10-week study. And the short version is they beat the ever living crap out of these people with aerobic training. However, they showed the average increase in VO2 max, I want to say, was from 42 to 60 in 10 weeks, which out of all the studies I've ever read in, I don't know, three decades now, that is the biggest increase in VO2 max I've ever seen in a moderately trained population. These are not untrained people. They're not elite level, but they're not untrained. The hard part is that I don't know any clients who I would put through that who would actually make it through 10 weeks. But can you take principles of how they applied that training and then take those parts out and apply it to other people? So a guy recently, so Brian Bornstein, he came to me and he's like, hey, I want to really increase my VO2 max. And he's a lifter, doesn't really compete, but, could be competing in natural bodybuilding. And we looked at his stuff and we said, okay, great. We'll do this 8-week program. And we took his 2K time on the rower, which we use as a marker. I want to say from 7:15 to 7:03, which is a pretty huge change for someone who's that well trained. The interesting part is that after we finished it, he's like, yeah, I don't want to do any more of that stuff again. I'm going to go kind of do my own thing for a while because it was so intensive.
Oh my God.
But a lot of the concepts that I used with him, I took from the Hickson study in 1977 and just tried to grade it to where he was at. So to
So
me, the concepts you can take, even though you may not be able to replicate the entire thing. The second part is a lot of this stuff is not new. Like that study was done in 1977. Now the mechanisms and how we got there, we know a lot more about, but the actual protocol, like that's by far like the best protocol I've seen per se.
Were you going to say something? I have something too.
yeah, actually, so you've read all this research, you train people on the daily, you've seen human performance optimization at a really granular level, Mike. For somebody working right now, listening to this in a corporate job that wants to be in really good metabolic health and physical shape, like what are the two biggest levers that they could do for the least amount of work to get into the best shape?
Yeah, if I were to pick just two, it would be do some form of movement every day. Obviously, I'd be biased, do some weight training Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, do some aerobic stuff Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday. Maybe Sunday's a complete unload day. You just go walk the dog or whatever. But figure out something you can do every day. And that may only be 20 minutes, it may be 10 minutes, maybe a half hour, maybe an hour. Like I think you can easily find a way to dedicate 30 minutes per day to do some type of purposeful movement. That would be number one. I was thinking about this the other day too, that I think if you have good movement and your exercise, if you want to use exercise as the term, is in place, you can make up for a lot of other sins. Right? There's even studies showing that exercise will recover metabolic health after sleep deprivation and all sorts of crazy stuff. Again, this isn't the best thing to do chronically, but it's just showing you that leverage with exercise and movement is probably number one. Number two, I would say, obviously I'm biased towards metabolic flexibility, but if you were to pick only one principle to follow, there's a bunch of heuristics you could pick, eat mostly whole foods, eat single ingredient, items. But at the end of the day, like thermodynamics and calories still work. Like most people are probably in too much of a caloric excess. So if you could stay at maintenance or even a little bit in a caloric deficit, even independently of nutrition quality, which obviously makes a massive difference and is super important, there's some interesting studies where people may have not done the best designed diet plan, but if they were, again, in a caloric deficit, it really makes up for a lot of sins, at least in body composition, which then furthers into health. That could be I don't know, 12 hours of lecture along those paths for sure. But I think just being in a caloric surplus or deficit is the one thing that just gets overlooked. And again, like if you're eating mostly single ingredient items, you're eating mostly whole foods, odds are you're probably going to end up there, pretty darn close to it anyway. So those would be the two if I had to pick two.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I hear what you're saying with like reading studies and then being able to like digest that and break it down for people. It sounds to me like, for our listeners, Mike, it sounds to me like you're willing to do the things that are hard that most people aren't willing to do. Because like reading that study, like that sounds like the most painful thing. Like that would be a torture for me. You know what I mean? Like, and I wouldn't even, and after I got done reading, I'd be like, what the fuck was that? I don't even know. Right. So it sounds like you've kind of built a career out of doing things most people aren't willing to do. Like, would you agree with that?
That's probably true. I didn't think it was that weird though, because to me it was like, oh, well, if you want the primary data, right? And Elon Musk has even said this, like, what do you go back to, like the basic scientific, first principles? Well, for research, if you're not conducting the study yourself, which you're going to be limited on, knowing how to analyze and to read other people's work is probably going to be right at the top of the list. And
Mm.
so for me, it was, yeah, studies are boring. They're not a lot of fun to read. But for me, it's actually kind of fun because I'm always looking for those little things that I can then apply to clients and get the feedback to see if that was actually beneficial or not.
Nice.
And so even now, like the greatest thing that ever happened was that I got an iPad several years ago and can put all my studies on an iPad. But I literally used to walk around with like my desk used to be just covered in printed papers. Like this is all old school now for people. Like I would have like a stack of papers like this big. I would just carry around at all times because like God forbid I had a couple of minutes I could read a study.
I know
And even
somebody
now,
like
like
that.
yeah,
Go ahead. Sorry.
and
Yeah, I
even
do the
now, like
same
I
thing.
feel like I'm working, especially after getting the books done, for
Mm.
literally just more time to read research.
Mm.
So
And
what
the
app do you
fascinating part is
use?
that most people don't actually read primary research. I just assumed everybody did for the longest time. The two things that stood out to me was now when you look at some of the papers that are open access, you're not behind a paywall, you can see how many people have downloaded them.
Mm.
And some papers get real popular. A lot of people download them. Who knows how many people read them? But a lot of papers, like those numbers are ridiculously small. Like maybe they read them online, maybe they didn't download them, whatever. And then it was something else. David Epstein said, who wrote the book Range, that he went back and read a bunch of primary research on the topic he was talking about. And you can trace in different fields where, even in academics, a lot of it is just parrots of, oh, I heard this one thing and this one researcher said it, so I'm going to say that. And you can trace stuff back that was over extrapolated from maybe like one study. Like the
Mm.
big one is the 10,000 hour rule. Like that has been hyper extracted from one particular study. And one of the main authors even came out later and said, oops, I'm sorry I ever said this in a lecture. It wasn't intended for this to be the thing that got, parroted by everybody else.
Really?
So stuff like that to me is just fascinating because humans are searching for efficiency. So it is more efficient, and I understand why people do it to, go to the expert and get information. God knows I do it all the time with my, physicians and my CPA and my attorney. I trust their opinion. The CPA doesn't need to read me the tax law. I get it. But I think if you're actually in the field and you are, air quotes, one of those experts, like you have to go all the way back to what the primary resources are.
So
Can I ask one more question before? Okay, so a lot of times I hear well, I guess like women in coaching and in the health and wellness space, they allude to that many studies aren't based on women. And I know this is kind of a hard left
Yeah.
turn from what we were talking about, but I mean, you're the guy who reads the studies. I'm curious, like, because our bodies are so much more complicated. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
That's actually pretty true. I
Is
mean,
it?
if you pull most of the data, if you think about where most of the data is generated, most of the data, at least in exercise performance and nutrition, in general, it's, like when I ran my study, okay, who the heck am I going to get to volunteer for this study?
Mm.
Oh, people at the university. Oh, other grad students. You're obviously in everyone else's study, whether it's a biopsy study, whether they give you, I had a nitroglycerin once to dilate all my blood vessels. They can do imaging. Like you're in every pilot study before it's even done. So most of the time, it's whatever population you can get to complete your studies. And for a longest time, unfortunately, because of menstruation periods and different things, hormonal changes, it was just literally easier to do dudes than it was women.
Yeah.
So people would write studies and say, we're just doing guys because, ooh, all this other stuff, we'll just exclude it. It doesn't matter. And on one hand, they're kind of correct because at the time, early on, there wasn't any data, period. So we had no data to go on at all. But unfortunately, in my opinion, that went on a little bit too long. And
Mm.
we started only accumulating data in men. And then eventually, like the funding sources changed. So for NIH, I think 3 or 4 years ago now, when you were writing a grant, you had to put in there if you were not going to study women, why exclusively you were not going to study women. And it could not just be, oh, they have a menstruation period, they're different. Like you had to have some justification of why you were doing it. They also did increase funding for women to actually be in more studies. There are more researchers actually looking at those topics now. The downside is that we're in this area where a lot of the answer is we just don't know, because a lot of those studies haven't come out yet. Some of them are starting to come out now. So we're just starting to get data out from that.
Yeah.
So in this sort of vacuum, you'll see things that are like, well, this study was done in guys, so it doesn't apply to women. Well, some of it doesn't matter. Like, you look at muscle fiber tissue under a microscope, it's pretty much identical. However, with other things, so for example, like hormonal impact of training, in theory, yeah, there's mechanistic changes that happen, but there's been like 2 or 3 studies now showing that, do you need to train specifically for, your menstruation cycle? Probably not. Again, that doesn't mean that won't be changed. That doesn't mean that there's not physical differences. It doesn't mean that mechanistically there's not different things during each portion of that. But I also then go back and think, experience-wise, I know a fair amount of high-level coaches, both professional and college, who train only females. I can't name one that does it specifically to where their menstruation cycle is. So again, you're back to this. Is it a real thing? Of course it is. Are there big changes that happen? Of course there are. Do we know from an application-based standpoint, is it a big enough thing to come out in the wash that we'd actually change the training? Right now, I'd say probably not. But again, that's just one example. And, 3 years from now, we'll have so much more data. I might be like, yeah, I don't know. I was like totally wrong on that.
Well, are you familiar with Dr. Mindy Pels?
Vaguely, yes.
Yeah, that's what she wrote the book on that, Fast Like a Girl. And so,
Yes.
I could sit here and ask you questions about
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I love her work, and that's not this podcast, but maybe we could do another podcast and talk about
Oh,
that.
for
'Cause
sure.
I think it's really an interesting conversation, because it's like coming from a male standpoint, and I keep hearing a lot of males, and I'm not trying to like go down this bunny hole, but it's just interesting coming from a female perspective versus a male. Like, are there changes? Yeah, blah blah. But she coaches Leanne Rhymes, and one of the things that she says right in the beginning of her book is like, when Leanne is ovulating, like they chart everything. Her concerts are always when she's ovulating, not when, like different parts of her cycle. So, there's something to that. I think that, doing more studies and kind of moving forward, and, I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
And I agree. Like, there's definitely something there. And on an individual basis, that makes sense to me. Like, real quickly, is like fasting. Like, you hear all this stuff like women shouldn't fast for long periods of time, and like most of my clients, 70% are actually women. So if you ask me that and say, for your clients and your experience, do females have a harder time with fasting? I would say yes. In my experience, that is true. However, my bias is I also see much higher stress level scores in women than I do in guys. So is it really a physiologic thing? Maybe, maybe not. My bias is I think it's because women tend to have higher levels of stress that makes fasting a bigger stressor to their physiology. So again, that gets down the whole thing of, is there actual differences? I think there are. Are they for the mechanisms that often get cited? Yeah, I don't know on that part.
Yeah. Yeah. Gabor Mate just wrote the book. What's the normal book? Do you remember the title of it? Something normal. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
The myth of normal. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
And in that book, he has a chapter, and I think it's something like women are society's, sponges of negativity, or not negativity. There's, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's like, yeah, there's so much stress in, I think, everybody's lives, and it's not normal, right? Like, I don't know. There's something there, but it's very interesting to see like our modern culture and like what we call culture, right? And how we operate, and how maybe, I don't know. And it's like a lot of the primal, people always go back to like, well, primal man would do this, but it's like, we're also not primal right now. Yes, we are physiologically, but we don't live that way, so, and I'm talking to Thaddeus Primalhacker. So it's like, it's such an interesting conversation. It's like, well, why would we live primal? I'm always asking questions because I'm super curious, and I'm like, but if we're living in 2024, why do we want to be like a cave person? They were probably freaking miserable, and starving most of the time. I don't know.
That's projection.
projection.
They
Maybe.
probably loved life.
Yeah,
Who
maybe.
knows?
Who knows?
But
What-
your physiology is tuned to the natural environment, and we've tuned
Yeah.
the environment in ways that don't match our physiology.
Mm,
Yeah. We have a lot of
So,
environmental mismatch now, I would
Yeah.
agree with.
right.
so what I want to go back to is like you had mentioned, and Heidi mentioned this too, doing things that others don't want to do. And I think that's true of whether you work in a corporation and you enjoy what you do because you've generated or created a place for yourself, or you're an entrepreneur. Like these groups of people do things that most people aren't willing to do because most people want to be comfortable and feel safe and not push themselves. But what we find is the people that do. You're Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and you're reading all the studies and you've got all this information that nobody else does. So you get invited to all these conferences and get paid to speak to teach people about what's in the studies and what you found in practicality. And I read all the laws around the world and the legal language and figure out like what do the laws actually say and how do we make sure we're compliant to them. Like no one wants to read the laws or deal with the regulators, but the people that actually get down to the nitty gritty and allow themselves to do that, what they find, and I think perhaps you found this, Mike, is it can be enjoyable to read those studies once you have done it enough to feel comfortable and not feel stressed. I don't know if you find that to be true.
Yeah, I have a list of studies that are in the area I feel comfortable. And then I have other lists of stuff that I don't know what the hell they're talking about half the time. And it's very easy just to read because I could find enough literature in areas that I feel somewhat competent in and just stay in that area. But some of the best things are like outside of what's called domain dominance, right? So do you know enough within your own area to kind of stray outside the boundaries, but you're not so crazy to assume that you've figured out the latest and greatest thing in a brand new field either. You know, you kind of need like the happy medium. And what I'll do even like at a bigger like physiology conferences is I'll just go up to random booths and just be like, "Hey, tell me about this thing." And I want to see could I actually have an intelligent conversation with them. You know, not that I'm going to be an expert or replace them, but at bigger conferences, that gives you a huge exposure. And if you're not sure, like, kind of where your edges are, like, that's one way you'll figure out real fast. I tell people, like, just go to every other booth. I don't care what it is, manufacturer, you know, genetic testing, you know, whatever. If you're at a big enough conference, there's going to be enough variety there. Like, experimental biology is a great place to do it. And then you'll know kind of where your boundaries are. And then you can decide, like, so certain things I'll read more of. So, for example, I took a 3-day neurology class in Orlando before we went to Mexico, and it was great. Like I knew the instructor through the Kerrigan Institute, was amazing, but I took 22 pages of notes. Like, and if you told me to go back and recite what part of the brain was triggered by a saccadic eye movement to the right, no fucking idea, right? But I know I can look that area up, and at some point, I will actually be able to tell you that. But like, so for me, that's an area that's functional. I can do lots of what looks like crazy shit. But compared to like the masters, like the person, my buddy David Traster teaching it, I'm an idiot with one eye, right? You know, but it's you're putting yourself in those positions and then coming back to apply it as soon as you can, and then going back again and reviewing the material and learning the structures. And so at time it'll become permanent. That to me, for me, that's still hard. I like it, but it's hard because you realize real fast like all the things that you don't know. And that's okay. Like, but you can then also apply it and learn it and get your reps in at the same time.
That's what I love is the application. So a lot of people, me included in the past, would get stuck in the learning, give me more, I want to learn more, but never applying it. And I think
Yes.
that's the key with the entrepreneurial mindset is you have to be willing to apply and not be 100% certain you know what you're doing.
Oh
So,
yeah.
and I heard you, Mike, say like, I started a business and I didn't know anything about business, but you did it anyway. And yes, you hired a coach to help you through some of the harder parts, but we as entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs within the corporation, we have to apply what we're learning. And get feedback on what's working and where we need to learn more and then apply again. And it's the people that get stuck in constantly learning and reading and studying, but never applying, that I think they don't really get anywhere.
No, and I get nervous about some people now because it seems to be the trend is the more you can appeal to like a higher level, like certain podcasts that have, PhDs running them who are great. A lot of the information can be really good, but there's this thing where people want the exact protocol, and I get why people give that, and I'm 100% guilty. I do the same thing, but there's a thing to want the protocol, but I would love to hear what the compliance of people doing the protocol is. I think there's something in our brain that says, oh, they'll pick on Andrew Huberman, who I like. He gave us the protocol for sleep. Great. Okay, but Bob, did you do that? Oh, no, wait, no, Bob's still on episode 749 because he doesn't think he has enough info and he hasn't seen the sunlight in 2 weeks, right? Or, your guys' information, that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
it seems to be like there's this humanistic thing where if we have a protocol, it almost replaces the action in our brain, and we feel like we're satisfied with that. And again, I'm not ripping on people who give out that type of information because people want to know what to do. Which is why I think in the business, what I've tried to do to separate that is if you want more protocols and you want that in-depth knowledge, in general, you have to pay for it. Because to me, there has to be some skin in the game. You have to weed out people who are kind of committed to doing it. And then a huge part of coaching, like you guys know, is making sure the person's compliant. Like there is a lot of accountability. And for the longest time, I didn't want to believe that. But there is. I mean, that's why I hire coaches, because I've hired coaches for my nutrition in the past, just because I know, at the end of the day, I just wasn't really getting it done. Part of it was just a compliance thing too.
Yeah, you pay out the money and it kind of keeps you honest, so to speak. You get
Yeah.
the protocol, but are you really going to do it? And I mean, if you're paying enough money, just like you said earlier about your business coach at $2,500 a month, you're damn well going to do the thing they tell you to do.
Oh yeah.
You paid all the money, and it's like, whatever, like you say this, I'm doing it. And I think that's something people overlook is like, no, I can get the free protocol from the internet. Well, you can, but are you actually going to do it and keep yourself accountable and get the nuance where it's not just follow the protocol, you have to tweak it for you and the coach can help. And by the way, you're really going to do it when you're paying. I did want to go back because entrepreneurs and even people within corporations that create their own thing, we go into modes where we learn and then we do. And in the learning mode, I tend to also read a lot of PDFs, and I had stacks of them like you did. And then I used to send them to Kindle, and the Kindle app would read them, but you can't do that anymore. Kindle won't let me send a PDF. So what's the app on your iPad where you can send a PDF and read it? Or do you just collect a file on your iPad with PDFs?
Yeah, I use Evernote, and I literally have 3 subfolders. One that's like research I've read, research to read, and then just general research. So there's some stuff like, hey, I found this cool study. I don't want to read it right now, but I'll just throw it in research. And then I've got a bunch of stuff in like to read research. They may be binned off in separate categories. And then within that, I had to kind of decide like what areas am I going to try to stay as complete as possible, because you can't on all areas. So for me, like I think I've read everything on metabolic flexibility that I can find. But that's a small enough niche topic where there's not that much. Or if you ask me about heart rate variability, I'd probably give you some pretty good answers. Have I read even a tenth of the material on heart rate variability? Honestly, no. Just because there's so many subfields and subfractures of where it goes, I just could not keep up with it. So ketones and performance, I can probably recite most of the stuff that's been done in that area. One, because that's what I get paid to do, and two, that then becomes a priority, but it's still kind of a small enough area you can get your arms around it. So part of within the to read area is what things am I going to make sure that I stay up on, and then what are kind of new different areas that are just interesting to do. Last part is that'll depend on the projects that I'm doing too. So for Andy Gelpin and Dan Garner, I also work with some of those guys at Rapid Health. For their independent project, I did a whole thing on red light stuff. And so that's something I've been reading off and on for God, probably like 8 years now. But to go back and to do that 3 hour presentation, shit, that took me like 10 months of reading. It was like 131 other studies I read or something for it. So depending on projects will also determine the priority of stuff within that.
It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that was
Oh,
just me
yeah,
picking a very fascinating, super interesting topic that has a lot of research in it.
right. Oh my
Lot,
God.
yeah.
Well, I keep hearing you saying like too, like kind of you're really niche. And I know that's kind of a buzzword right now, especially in like YouTube videos and people that are, you know, motivational people, I guess influencers on YouTube. Um, People are saying niche down, and then you hear the
Yeah.
opposite. They're like, no, don't niche, go wide. You know, it's like, oh my God. Do you have any insight onto like it seems like niching down has worked for you?
Yeah, I'm one of those weird people where I think having a niche is definitely beneficial. If someone were to start out right now, I'd say, for God's sakes, pick a niche, because most of the people I work with, at least in the mastermind and that type of thing, they're all across the board, and it makes it too hard for them to communicate what they do.
Mm,
So like when I had a business coach, like the biggest arguments we've always had was he's like, you just need to pick a topic. Like you can't talk about this, you can't talk about that. And
mm,
so one of the reasons I picked metabolic flexibility, in addition to that was all my research was in, is that it's a niche area, but it lets me talk about fat metabolism, ketones, lactate. Within that area, I can talk about a lot of stuff because it literally is incorporated into the term.
mm,
So to me, that was like the compromise we kind of got to was I can say metabolic flexibility, that is the niche area of metabolism. Obviously, you'd want to make it for performance or body comp or your outcome. But within that, I still have the freedom to kind of go in these different areas.
mhm,
And then the other thing I did was if I did work for another organization, it would tend to be only for one particular thing. So I worked for Brian Grasso and Kerry Campbell for quite a while with Mindset Matters Most. So we did whole certifications there, and I was just the research guy who just looked at the neurobiology of like how do we have different mindset principles? Like, can we go all the way back to base them on how you take information in, sensory input, all that kind of stuff.
mm,
I teach RPR once in a while, reflexive performance reset, which is a hands-on therapy technique. Um, but most of the people who I taught for that before COVID, they just knew me as a crazy RPR guy, right? And so I think you can do variety, but you can still be niched within each of those areas, but it has to be intentional. And usually it's with another organization
mm,
because they're going to have the distribution ability to do it. If you're just distributing all of that stuff yourself, it can become like overwhelming. So people like send me crazy emails of like, oh, well, if you love RPR so much, why don't you talk about it a lot in your newsletters? I'm like, well, it's hard to explain. It's something I do usually in person, and it just gets too confusing with the message that I'm trying to showcase in the newsletter. It gets to be too across the board. So I think it's finding the balance of what do you like doing and what are people willing to pay you for. So
mm,
my little internal thing I have is great. If I learn some new technique, so I've been doing hands-on stuff since 2006. Can I get people to pay me a market value for only hands-on work in person? Right. So like now I charge like $250 a session. Will they pay me only for that? They don't know me for anything else. Cool. Okay. Could I potentially teach or educate people in that only that one thing? Great. Cool. So that's like my little internal thing. And then once I can do that internally, then I'm like, okay, now I can kind of play with mixing different fields together and testing different things. I think a lot of people go to a weekend course and now they're the metabolic type expert or whatever. And it's like, okay, that's useful, that's good, but I've given people the advice of just go only practice that one thing. It's like when I took a lot of PRI courses, all I did was PRI because I wanted to get good enough at that technique and then figure out how am I going to blend it. Where a lot of people, I think, I got this from Tom Myers. He's like, if you if you're not a really good chef and you just throw a bunch of stuff into a pot to create a stew, you just have shit stew. He's like, if you're a world class chef, you can take things that don't look like they would agree and you can make it taste good. He's like,
mm,
a lot of people are running around thinking they're a world class chef, but they're just at level one. He's like, just get good at making one type of stew and just get really good at doing that. And then pick another type and get really good at doing that. And then later you can kind of, play with different ingredients together.
Oh, I love that.
That's great advice. Yeah. Love it. Should we wrap up? Or do you have any more?
Nope,
Questions?
those were my questions.
Okay.
So anything else, any other advice, Mike, that we didn't get to talk about that you would offer to people stuck in their corporate jobs?
I mean, the biggest thing is probably a Simon Sinek thing. Like, it kind of starts with why. Like, why do you want to leave? And to me, what do you want to do with your life? Which I know is like a huge overarching question that's too hard to wrap your head around. So for clients, I'll have them write out their perfect day, which I stole from Craig Ballantyne. No, no restrictions. Just, okay, if you wake up and you had to work, what would your perfect day look like? Where would you live? What would you do? How would it be set up? What food would you eat? How would you exercise? All those things. Don't worry about how it's going to happen. And the hardest part for people to do is literally to imagine it without restrictions. Because their first question then is, well, I want to live in wherever. I don't know how to get there. That wasn't the point. The point is figure out what is the destination you want to go. Make sure that that's really clear. Write it out multiple times. No restrictions. And then you can go backwards from there to figure out how to make it happen. And that might be, 1, 2, 3, 10-year plan, whatever. But most people just haven't given themselves permission to think, what do they really want to do and what does success look like? And then it's really easy to get stuck. And I still have this habit too of getting into the day-to-day things, and I got to answer this email and this project and that project, and it's easy to get bogged down by everything else too. So I would say start there, figure out how you want to engineer your life, give yourself permission to just write it out, and then you can come up with smaller steps to get closer to that.
That's great.
I love that. And I think most people, even though they might have heard that before or not, they don't do it. And so they're like, oh, I kind of know, what I want it to be like. I don't really believe you unless you have written it out in full. And you'll find some really interesting things come out when you start really thinking about it and feeling those emotions and like living that day that will surprise you. So the exercise of physically doing it, and it could change over time as you evolve, right? I think is super powerful. So I really appreciate that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great.
And my last little part on my first 2 steps on that was to kiteboard on a trip for longer than a week. And my other one was to not set an alarm on Monday morning. Those are like my first 2.
And where are you? You did both of those, yeah?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so again, like one of them's a little bit bigger. The other one's like a pretty small thing, but you can have like those little markers along the way just to help keep you on task.
I love that. Mine back in the day has changed, but 15 years ago, it was to work from home, AKA work from anywhere. I was tied to manufacturing plant. So I was always in the plant. I had to be on call. Any work I had to do was with the equipment in the plant. I couldn't go anywhere. So it was like work from anywhere and have basically unlimited vacation. So I can vacation for as long as I wanted to, wherever I wanted to, and not have to worry about coming back to work for any, specific time. So anyway,
Nice.
I also within the corporation have achieved both of those, but I had to have that goal of like, what is my perfect day and how do I work backwards from there? And as we talked about earlier, how do I start letting people know like, hey, like I want to work from home. Well, you're not good enough. We wouldn't do that. We would just hire somebody else. Okay. So I've got to be really good, irreplaceable for me. Could be different depending on the job you get, but I made myself irreplaceable. And I was like, hey, I'm going to go live in Minnesota. And they're like, okay, go do it. And you can stay working here. Right. So it worked out great. But it was slow over time. And they at first told me that I would be for only 6 months. It's been 17 years. They told me I would never get a raise again. I got a raise. They said I would never be promoted if I did that. Then in 2020, everyone worked from home. So just don't believe what you hear, believe in what your vision is and find a way to make it happen. So you did that for yourself and I'm still on that journey. So I love your stories, Mike. Thank you so much for being here. Anything else, Heidi?
Yeah, that's a wrap. Thank you so much, Mike, for your time and energy, expertise, inspiration, all of it. It's beautiful. Thank you.
Well, yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me on here. I really appreciate